So I wanted to make a video just without a skit this time, just to jump straight into the topic, but I wanted to ask you, do you like the skits? Do you want me to just jump straight into the topic? I kind of need your feedback with that. I like the skits. Do you like the skits? Write in comments down below. Let's just get started with this. So today I wanted to get into this phenomenon where video games get bigger and bigger. They're overpassing or surpassing, that's the right word. They're surpassing the movie industry in terms of sales, revenue, and yet there's no mainstream coverage in entertainment news. But why? Haven't video games been around long enough where we can get kind of respect and there's not this sort of stigma for gamers for enjoying their hobby? What's the deal? Why aren't video games accepted into the mainstream? And that's kind of what I talk about today. But before we get started, hi, my name is Adam. And if you're new here and you're a human being, maybe you should click that subscribe button so you can join our community of other human beings so that you can get to know when all these videos come out, as well as our weekly podcast. So, like I said before, if you're new here and you haven't yet, and you're so inclined to, click that subscribe button. Yeah. So why, after all these years of video games being around, for the long history of it, why is there still no acceptance in the mainstream? Why isn't there a lot of coverage with it? That's kind of what I get into today, and there's a couple reasons what we can really look at and kind of understand the mainstream's mindset in terms of video games. But that's kind of what I talk about today. But you know, before we get started, I think it's important to know where this all began and how video games got started. Where did it all begin for the mass market of video games? So while I might get a lot of flack from retro gamers or game history enthusiasts for what I'm about to say, I do understand that video games have had a much longer journey than, you know, the home console business. I mean, you can go all the way back to the 1950s when some MIT students made an on-screen tic-tac-toe game. Here's the thing, when we're talking about the mass market where families were really getting into video games and how video games entered into the home, you really got to talk about the 1970s in that point. In this 1970s, you know, you really had the Atari Pong game where it just had the one and it made huge strides in family homes. And even with that, I would like to argue that you can't really say that the mass market of video games and home consoles, it didn't start until the Atari 2600. And I know, there might be some, you know, flack for saying that, but I'm saying it anyway. But with the Atari 2600, that's when it really comes to be in the home console, playing multiple games, and it really made strides in that way. And you're really talking in the 1970s there. Now, Teacher Adam, why are you bringing up the Atari 2600 when we're talking about the history of video games? Why even talk about the Atari 600? I'm an NES boy. Well, here's the thing. If we're going to make the argument that the Atari 2600 made the mass market, like what video games are today, what home consoles are today, let's talk about that beginning and let's really put into perspective there. The video game market hasn't been around long enough to get that kind of respect because the medium as a whole really got its start with the Atari 2600. And yes, there were the arcades, but I'm talking about home consoles here. But with the Atari 2600, that came out in September of 1977. Putting that in perspective, the very first Star Wars movie came out May 25th, 1977 of the same year. To really put that in perspective, the Star Wars franchise is older than the home console medium. That's kind of wild to me that it's just that young. So really, we have this really recent medium of entertainment, whereas movies, music, books, they already have their establishments. They've been around for hundreds of years. So was it a success from the 1970s? So the Atari 2600, was that the beginning of where everything went? Not really, because going flash forward here, we're going to go into, you know, the infamous little ET dump where everything was buried a little bit. Game developers and the video game industry as a whole really didn't know how to handle itself. It didn't know the market for itself. It didn't really have any kind of control when it first started. So these games would just keep popping off and, you know, a lot of games would come out with not a lot of quality check and you just had these horrendous games coming out, and the market just got way out of hand, way out of control, and nobody was stopping them until the consumer said, we've had enough. And even moving more flash forward is that the ET games, when they weren't successful, they got buried in landfills. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of copies buried in landfills because of the lack of success it had. And really put this in perspective, this is all in the terms of 6 years. 6 years from the start of the Atari 2600, and the burial was about 6 or 7 years. And that wasn't a good light on the whole video game industry. So you really have to look at the beginning of video games when we're really talking about why doesn't it have any like kind of mass market or mainstream media outlets looking at video games. And putting all this perspective is that, you know, markets were looking at this, adults at the time were looking at this, and so far we're not seeing a really good life cycle of video game industry. Just when we thought the video game industry was going to be this mass market huge success in the homes of families, it just goes straight up and it peaks and then just crashes and burns in the matter of just a few years, you know? Hey, but the Atari 2600 had a better life cycle than the Wii U. Am I right, fellas? Am I right? Yeah, it's just me, right? Okay, well, yeah. So far in 1977, we get our start of the video game industry. It's not looking good for video games in terms of mainstream audiences, to where we think that, video games, that's just kind of like this weird fad that happened and just crash and burn. And so far, the mainstream outlets are like not looking so kindly at that. So it could have just all died out there. We could have never seen video games ever again. And it would have been a sad day for us because that's a moment in history. That is until Nintendo slammed their foot in front of the door before it shut close. But at a cost. Hey fellas, you remember using Axe body spray as a kid? Come on, you know you did. You were a stinky 6th grader just like me, and you used to spray that all over you like a crop duster. But yeah, y'all remember Axe body spray? I mean, I say it like a joke, but really, let's really think about Axe body spray for a second. When it first came into the market as almost like a cologne alternative or a spray on deodorant, they had this choice to make where who we gonna market this to, what's gonna make the most success, and the marketing team said, you know what? Middle school boys, let's just really go hard and just market towards them, and let's let them have it of like, this is your cologne. And did that marketing scheme work? Well, your boy went hard on the Kilo scent. Kilo was your boy's scent. So yes, it did work. I was a stinky 6th grader, so it worked. But here's the problem. As the people who grew up with Axe knows, like, we got older and we couldn't disassociate Axe body spray from, you know, a kid's product. You know, you got older and you're just like, I want to use grown-up stuff. I want to use, you know, I don't know, Adidas cologne. I don't know what grown-ups. I use Adidas cologne now. But that's the thing, is that trying to convince a grown 29-year-old like me to use Axe body spray, unironically, by the way, it's a bit hard because you associate that as a children's product. Think of the way you perceive Axe body spray, and that's essentially how the mainstream market, you know, associates video games because of the way they were marketed by Nintendo. When Nintendo came into the Western markets in 1985, when the Famicom system was a huge success in Japan, they had this kind of choice to make. They knew about the video game market dipping in the United States, and they had this kind of choice to make. Do we put it as an electronic, or do we market it as a toy where kids can enjoy and parents will buy it for them because it's a toy? It's not a VHS player, it's a toy. And guess what? The marketing team, when they came to the Western market, said, listen, we gotta put this in the toy aisle, and that's when it's gonna make most of the sales. And did that marketing scheme work? Boy, it did, because your boy had Kilo. Wait, no, we're not talking about X. We're talking about NES. But that's the thing, is that marketing scheme really worked. Is that they had to market it to kids to really get the NES really flowing and being trusted in the Western markets. So yes, as we know, the marketing for the NES and video games throughout that, it did work. It did work. It honestly did work. And that's how we know video games today, but it came as a cost. See, the reason why I brought up Axe in the first place is to really put your minds into the mainstream markets, because this is just 1985. This was just a few years ago. 1985. I'm just a little bit younger than that. And I'm not that old, I don't think. Well, here I am. But think about that. The way we perceive Axe body spray as a children's product, as a middle schooler product, that's kind of how the mainstream market works. It's that they see video games and they see the way they were marketed in 1985, and they sort of can't disassociate with that. Even probably there were people who grew up in 1985 knowing or being marketed to as, the NES was, as a children's product, and they can't kind of disassociate to that. They kind of say that, well, I've grown up, I used to play video games as a kid, but in the same way with Axe, right? So trying to convince the mainstream market that, video games aren't for kids anymore, it's kind of, again, like the example of trying to get me to use Axe body spray unironically. There's this sort of market that happened not too long ago in the 80s that mass media markets say, video games are for kids. I can't disassociate from that because the marketing was so strong in that demographic. So while Nintendo should be praised for bringing back the video game industry stronger than ever, and I think we need to thank Nintendo for bringing in the video game industry as we know it, because they've done a lot to do that. They had to do it at a cost. They had to do it as a price, or else the video game industry wouldn't survive in that climate. Okay, so for argument's sake, let's say the mainstream media forgot about the rocky start to the Atari 2600. Let's say that's all in the past and they forgot about that. And let's say video games have now proven themselves that, video games are no longer in the toy section, but they're a legitimate medium for entertainment. There's, good Hollywood actors that get involved with video games nowadays. Let's say the mass media is accepting of all of that. And let's also say that you won't unsubscribe to me if you're also an adult and use Axe body spray. I still love you. But it was also marketed heavily towards middle schoolers. But anyways, let's say all that aside, there's still one key piece of the puzzle that I think we're all forgetting, and it's kind of an important one when it talks about why isn't it being covered in mainstream media today. So when I talk about accessibilities in video games, I'm not just talking about adaptive controllers for people with handicapped needs. And I think that's highly important when we're talking about the accessibility of video games. Even Sony's playing their part in by making a detachable touchpad that writes in Braille. This is highly important when talking about video game history, and highly important when we want more gamers into the community. But what I'm mostly talking about when in terms of accessibility in video games is that mainstream audiences aren't used to interacting with the entertainment that they consume in an active way that video games require you to. Video games are so much more different from movies, books, and music because each of these mediums only require you as a passive audience. You can just sit on your couch and put on a movie, and all you have to do is just sit and enjoy. But video games are much more different in that way because it's not asking you to be a passive audience. It's requiring your active participation in making the story go forward. And mainstream audiences aren't really used to that. And to ask them to do that is, kind of a lot. To ask somebody to live in a story, pick up a controller, figure out how the controller works, how to hold the controller, what actions go where, what buttons are doing what. It's a lot to ask somebody who's never done that before. For one story, I still remember telling my mom about Star Wars The Force Unleashed and how it was this this amazing story in between episode 3 and episode 4 in the Star Wars movies, and she was very interested into hearing that story. And then I told her it's only in a game. And yes, I know there's a novelization of the game, but to really feel the impact of it, I really believe that the game of The Force Unleashed is the best way to consume it. But when I told my mom that, she just didn't want to consume it that way. She wanted to know the story in between 3 and 4, but to require her to know how the 360 works, how to put in the game, how to pick up the controller, learn the timing of the enemies, just to see the story of The Force Unleashed is a lot to ask of her. It's not really something we think about as gamers, especially ones who have grown up with video games. It's not something we think of because it's almost second nature to us. But when somebody is interested in the narratives of the games we play, and even just the community of gamers and how friendly we are, someone who is interested into entering that community, it's a lot to ask for them because they're going from a passive audience to an active audience. Not only that, but we're entering into a generation that doesn't even use DVD players to consume movies anymore. Even with music, we're so used to streaming our entertainment now. I know Google Stadia is kind of controversial now, but streaming services are so important when talking about, hey bro, no, save it for another video. This video is getting a little too long. But this is kind of important to know where mainstream audiences are coming from and where they consume their media. Yeah, I know I'm in your head too. In fact, I am kind of your conscience. How many video ideas do you really have up here anyway? Save it for another video. Yeah, you're right. You're a good person. You never let me down. Recently, anyway. So like I said, for the mainstream audience, there's a lot to unpack when first starting a video game. You know, the menus, how a controller works, how a narrative works, how enemies are timed. It's a lot to ask for, and I think that's an important piece to why mainstream audience haven't really caught on to video games at this point. So yes, we have this kind of rocky start in the 1970s, and yeah, it was marketed towards kids, and even more so, you know, it's hard to pick up as someone who's never been in a community before. But with all this added together, is there still hope for the video game industry? You know, I kind of think there is. So video games aren't really talked about or even really picked up when talking about the mainstream media outlets or any kind of entertainment news. But in my opinion, I think we just need to be patient and wait for more consumers to understand what video games are all about. Video games as a medium for entertainment have only been around for a short period of time, and in comparison to movies, music, sports, they've only been around for a short period of time in comparison. And in that short time, you know, the identity of video games has really changed in that scene. The stereotype that video games are only for children came back from a marketing idea that was only 35 years ago. And even before that, you know, video games were flooded with the market and people didn't know how to handle it. It's only been around for a short period of time and it still hasn't gotten its firm grasp and firm stance and identity in that point. But as years go forward, technology advances, Hollywood stars are getting more involved in video games. It's only a matter of time when we as gamers, as we get older and, you know, we start to see things a little bit differently, we start to treat video games in a different light, that video games are a legitimate source of entertainment. And there's going to be a day where the mainstream audiences are going to include it in entertainment news. It's just a matter of time. But until then, let's just let video games be its thing. Let the video game industry really establish themselves, really make an identity for themselves. And we just have to be patient and let the years go on. And we as a community of gamers need to be respectful for other mediums and not try to gatekeep people from entering our community. Let's just let video games thrive and let's just enjoy the ride while we're still here. Hey, what's up, human beings? It's me, Adam, again. You know, just want to thank you for watching this week's video. If it seemed like I'm like a little bit all over the place in this video, you know, there's some, you know, serious health issues that are going around at the time of this filming, so I might not all be there, but, you know, I still thank you for watching this week's video. Yeah, we just had a lot of fun writing and we had a lot of fun making it, and I'm glad you're enjoying these videos. I'm glad you're commenting on them, and if you haven't yet, comment down below. Why do you think mainstream audiences don't really accept video games at this point? Really want to hear from you. And if you haven't yet, click that subscribe button. That's staying in, as well as that notification bell. But I really thank you for sticking around. I'm glad you're enjoying the videos, and we're gonna make so much more of these. And you know, just, you know, thanks for sticking around. All right, I'm gonna leave now. Bye.